Okay, so to get started here, let's talk about what exactly it is that we're going to be doing from a WebSockets perspective. All right, so currently we're only using WebSockets on a single page of our application, and that is the note detail page, right? Now, the main purpose of this, as you well know, is so that if multiple users are taking a look at the same note, and a user is editing the content of that note, the changes that that user is making to the note will be sent to the server and propagated to the rest of the users who are currently looking at that note, right? So in other words, we're keeping the note information on all of the users who are currently looking at that note's browsers in sync with each other. All right, so this has been so far a surprisingly complex thing to create, but ultimately we've gotten it working to a pretty high degree. So what we're going to take a look at here is how to extend the concept of WebSockets to other pages. Now, in particular, one thing that we can do, and what we're going to take a look at how to do here now, is extend WebSockets to our notes page, right? Our notes list page where we display all of the user's notes in a list. So what we're going to be doing with this one is having this page actually load its notes initially via a WebSocket instead of by making a network request to our server, right? Because currently what this notes page does is when we first visit the page, it makes a GET request to the server. All right, just going to draw that like that. It makes a GET request to the server, and the server takes care of getting all of the notes for that user from the database and sending them back as a response to that request. Now, this works perfectly fine, right? It's a pretty common pattern to have a page just load its initial data and not really worry too much about it after that. However, let's say that we want this notes page to be a little more interactive than it has been so far. For one thing, let's say that we have another user over here who's on the sharing settings page for a given note, and let's say that they add this user here as a shared user for that note. Okay, so in other words, this user can now access that note. Well, that's not actually going to show up in the user's shared section on the notes page unless this user refreshes the page and the page actually loads all of that note data all over again. Now again, if it's our desire to make our application as interactive and responsive as possible, then having shared notes immediately show up on our notes page is going to be a pretty neat feature to implement. So let's talk a little bit about how this is going to work, right? Now that we know our goal is to add WebSockets to the notes page so that when, let's say a user shares notes with another user, that note shows up immediately on that other user's browser. The way that this is going to work, let's say we have a user here, and they're on, of course, the notes list page, so we'll just say notes, and then it's got the list there. What's going to happen is instead of making a request to our server over here to load the initial data, our notes page is actually going to establish a WebSocket connection with the server instead, okay? So what's going to happen, we'll have this WebSocket connection open, and it's just going to be a persistent connection between the front end and the server. And when that connection is first established, the server is going to send back all of the note data to our client side, and that's where our client side is going to get the initial data from. Now, this has the added advantage of, since this connection is still open, let's say we have another user over here again who shares a note with this user by making a request to the server, right? They're on the share settings page. They make a put request or a post request, I don't remember which one it is exactly, to share a note with this user. Well, what we want the server to do in that case is both respond to this client saying, yep, everything's good, we updated that note, we shared it with that user, and we want to send an event through this WebSocket connection to this client saying, hey, good news, you just had another note shared with you, all right? So that's what establishing this WebSocket connection from our notes page allows us to do. Now, let's talk a little bit from a code standpoint about where this is all going to go down. Because as I've been talking about this, I've been saying that it's the notes page that's going to establish this connection, but that's actually not exactly true. What's actually going to be establishing this connection is instead going to be our notes provider component, all right? The one that takes care of loading all of the notes from the get-go and providing those to any of the pages that need them. All right, so again, our notes provider is currently the one that's making those requests to the server, and it's now going to be the one that creates this persistent connection to our server instead. So that's going to be our basic strategy, right? Just to draw this out a little more neatly, we have our notes page, all right? Our notes page uses data from our notes provider. So I'll just say notes provider. And our notes provider is going to be the one that establishes this connection with the server. And the server is going to make sure that our notes provider is kept up to date with any new notes that are, let's say, shared with it. All right, so that's going to be our basic plan of attack for this. So the first step in all of this is going to be going into our backend and adding a new type of connection, right? Remember that in this socket connections folder, we've only so far defined a single connection, which is our note detail connection. Right now, our note detail connection, this is the connection that's established between our client side and our server when the user goes to the details of an individual note, and that allows, again, all of the users who are currently viewing a particular note to see those updates in real time. All right, so that's what this note detail connection is this one right here when the user is on the note detail page. Maybe they're even editing it like that. But we're going to have to define now another type of connection for when the user is on the notes page, right? The page that displays the notes list. And for this one, we're going to just come up with another name for this. Maybe we'll call it the all notes connection, something like that. Basically, just a name that expresses that this is loading and dealing with all of the notes on a high level instead of with individual notes on a detailed level. And this is really not that much different, by the way, from just making network requests, right? In this case, we would be making a GET request for a single note, right? And under normal circumstances, we would say notes/123. And in this case, we would just be loading all of the notes. So we would probably say something like get/notes. So what we're doing here is we're really just creating different types of socket connections for those different situations. And this isn't strictly necessary. We could make all of this work with a single socket connection, but what I've found is that it can be a lot easier to keep everything organized if you have multiple socket connections, right? It reduces the chances of you accidentally emitting events where they shouldn't be emitted to users who shouldn't see them. So with all that said, let's create a new connection besides our note detail connection. What this is going to look like, we're going to create a new file which we'll call the all notes connection.js. And we're going to define this in a very similar way that we defined our note detail connection. All right, we're going to say export const all notes connection. And this is going to be an object with a few important properties. Now, one of those important properties is going to be this name here. So we'll say name, and we're going to call this one all notes, right? And that's in contrast to note detail, which we had for this connection. You'll see how we actually use these things shortly, because I don't believe that we're currently using this for anything. So now that we have that name, let's establish the onConnect function. Remember that we added this for our note detail connection. This contains the logic that gets executed when a new client connects, right? So that we can do things like reject them if they don't have access, things like that. For this one, we're going to define our own function, so we'll come back to that. I'm just going to put an empty no-op function there for the time being. For middleware now, we're going to actually use the same type of middleware that we used for our note detail connection. So if you want, we can just copy this and paste it. And we're going to have to import those as well. So let's just copy those and paste them up at the top. There we go. And finally, we're going to have our event handlers. Now, this one's going to be a little strange because it's actually not going to respond to any events directly besides the connect event. So we're just going to say event handlers. There we go. And empty array is going to be what that is. Now, this might seem a little strange, but if we think again about the situations where this is going to be used, right? Let's say again that our user is looking at their notes page with the list of notes. And they have a connection open with the server, of course, a WebSocket connection. Well, what's going to happen is when another user comes along and shares a note with this user, they're not going to be making that request via a WebSocket. I mean, they could, it's a possibility, but since we already have our endpoints set up and there's not really any benefit to doing that in this case, what they're going to do is just send a network request updating that note, and the event is going to come from our server and go to our client telling them that a new note was shared. Right? So in other words, in this connection, at least for the time being, we're not expecting any events to come through from the client side, right? There's nothing that the client side would do from here that would benefit from a WebSocket connection. All right, so anyway, hopefully that makes sense so far. The next thing that we're going to do is add this all notes connection to our server. Let's open up server.js and go to where we're adding all of the different listeners, handlers, that kind of thing to our connection. What we're going to do here is we're going to use this name property now of our different types of connections to decide which event handlers and middleware we should add to our I/O. So here's what that's going to look like. For each of our socket connections, and remember, by the way, that these socket connections are what's being exported from this index.js file, so we'll want to add our all notes connection to this. All right, so back in our server.js file now, oops, let's open that up again, close that somehow. When we're looping through all of those connections, of which we only have two right now, our note detail connection and our all notes connection, we're going to want to find out what kind of connection this socket that's currently in the process of connecting wants, right? Does it want a note detail connection or does it want an all notes connection? Well, the way that we can find that out, if we go back to our note detail page, is by taking a look at where we connect. Oh, that's actually in a custom hook now. I forgot about that. We need to go back to use note. And when we're first creating our socket connection, what we're going to want to do here is add a name property to the query, and that's going to be note detail. Now, what this name query parameter is going to do when we're creating this connection is allow our server to know where this connection is coming from, right? What page this connection wants. So going back to our server.js file now, what we're going to do is take a look at the socket's query object to see what type of connection is being used. And as a matter of fact, we're not going to want to use a for loop for this anymore. Instead, what we're going to do is say const connection equals socket connections dot find, and we want to find a connection where the name, so connection.name, is equal to the socket's query parameter, and we're going to say socket.handshake.query, and that is going to give us the connection that the client side wants, right? The client side is going to tell us whether or not it wants a note detail or an all notes connection. So what we can do now is we can move all of this in one, right? We can unindent it because we're not inside a for loop anymore. We're only dealing with a single connection, which we're choosing using that query parameter. So what this is going to do now, it's pretty much the same as before. We're just calling the connections on connect function. We're checking to see if that was successful. If it was successful, we add all of the event handlers that were defined on that connection to the socket. Okay, so that's inside the connection callback. We're going to want to do pretty much the same thing with our middleware, where we're defining io.use. What we're going to do, same thing. In fact, we can just copy and paste this and put that up here and remove the for loop. And again, what we're doing is we are looping through all of the middleware for this connection, checking to make sure that everything is good there. If something goes wrong, we just return and never call next. If all of the middleware passes, right, if the user meets all of that criteria for connecting, then we call next, which lets us get down to here. All right, so anyway, that's how we add a new type of connection to our server. And this is going to make our job really quite easy for adding all of the logic we want to add to our all notes connection. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.